Johnny brought me 1,500 fishing hooks and said, try to surprise me with these. I took that as a serious challenge. First, I built a steel container and packed all 1,500 fishing hooks inside. To fill the empty spaces between the hooks, I added steel powder, making sure it worked its way into every gap. Once the container was completely packed, I sealed it shut. Then I fired up my charcoal forge and placed the container deep into the fire. When it became extremely hot, I started forging it carefully. At first, I used light, controlled hammer blows from every side, trying to compress everything as evenly as possible. I continued until I could feel that the hooks and steel powder inside had fused together into one solid mass. Then I allowed the container to cool. Using an angle grinder, I cut off both ends, opened the outer shell, and removed the solid steel billet from inside. I welded a long handle onto the billet, fired up the forge again, and started the real forging process. This time, I hit the hot steel much harder, using the full force of my hammer. And yes, I did all of this completely by hand. No hydraulic press, no power hammer, just the old-fashioned way, like blacksmiths did generations ago. And believe me, it was exhausting. At the end of the day, I had forged the billet down into a plate approximately 4 millimeters thick. Then I forged the blade tip and shaped the tang for the handle. And this is what the rough forged blade looked like at the end of the day. The next morning, I continued working at the belt grinder. First, I had to remove all the hammer marks and uneven areas left on both sides from forging. I leveled both surfaces and then moved on to refining the contours. To make this easier and more precise, I drew the final knife shape directly onto the steel and carefully followed those lines on the belt grinder. There were a few tight areas around the handle that I couldn't reach with the grinder, so I finished those sections by hand using a metal file. Next, I marked and drilled the holes for the bolster and handle pins, and at this point, the knife was finally starting to take its proper shape. Now came one of the most important stages of the entire build, grinding the bevels. The bevels play a huge role in both the appearance and cutting performance of a knife, so I worked very carefully on both sides. After several hours at the belt grinder, the bevels were finally finished. Next, I sanded the entire blade to 150 grit to prepare it for heat treatment. I fired up my charcoal forge once again and placed the blade inside. When the steel reached approximately 850 degrees Celsius, I quickly quenched it in oil. Now the blade was hardened and ready for the next stage. I returned to sanding, starting again at 150 grit and gradually working my way all the way up to 2,000 grit. Once the surface was completely finished, I thoroughly washed the blade and removed every trace of oil and grease. Then I placed it into ferric chloride for several minutes. And finally, this was the moment I had been waiting for throughout the entire project. Just look at that pattern. The 1,500 fishing hooks created an incredible texture across the surface of the blade. Now it was time for the handle. I made a simple but beautiful bolster from brass, using 2 brass plates and pins to secure them tightly on both sides of the blade. For the handle itself, I chose a solid piece of Greek walnut. I drew the handle shape onto the wood and shaped both pieces on the belt grinder. Then I drilled the holes and attached the wooden scales using epoxy and brass pins. I left everything to cure overnight. The next day, once the epoxy had fully hardened, I returned to the belt grinder and removed all the excess wood. After that, I finished the handle by hand, sanding the walnut to 220 grit. Once the wood was completely smooth and clean, I applied a special protective wax. The wood absorbed the wax beautifully, bringing out the natural grain while also helping protect it from moisture. Finally, I sharpened the blade all the way to 4,000 grit and finished the edge on a leather strop. Now it's razor sharp and cuts beautifully, and this is the final result. A handmade knife forged from 1,500 fishing hooks. If you think I won this challenge too, make sure to subscribe to my channel.